working on at the moment, what influences them, and also we're going to touch on the end a little bit about collecting, not just in terms of what you as collectors are bringing into your homes, but also what the artists have in their homes and how that affects not only the works that they're producing, but just the way they live within their homes. So I'm stealing this question from Luke because he is an expert at doing these talks and he always begins every talk this way. And I think it's a really nice way of getting to know who we have here in the room with us. So if we could have a quick show of hands to any collectors we have. Well, I would imagine most of you are collectors in one sense or another. Do we have any artists with us today? I recognise a few of our artists here. And then, have we got any aspiring collectors who maybe haven't started their journey yet, but are looking towards collecting in the future? You're well on your journey. Well, that gives us a good idea. So what we're going to start on, I think, is the actual studio days of our artists. So a nice little intro into this, I think, is for each one of you, whoever would like to jump in first, what is your favourite day in the week and why? And the mic goes to you.
Oh. Well, mine would be Saturday. And Saturday to me is a treat day because it's like well, you can't hear me. Really? It's Saturday because I've worked all week. I've either worked in my day job or I've worked in the studio. And so Saturday's a treat day. And and I think there's kind of like, there's no pressure on me when I go, because it feels like an extra. It's a bonus day that I sort of feel like I can really enjoy what I do in the studio on Saturdays.
So we've stolen your day from you today.
Yeah, and I think you become quite sort of, I think because like generally most artists would have another day job. That's the kind of norm. And so studio days become very, very precious. And I'm very reluctant to share them with other things. I mean, I'm sure that's the same for all of us, most artists. And you kind of have to be very strict with your timing. And I think that's probably one of the best things an artist can be, is organised with your time. And actually, you don't go, oh, I don't feel like it today. You have to go. That's the rules.
Ria Studio is beautiful. It's converted stable, isn't it?
I think originally it was stables, and then it was a box factory.
You're very fortunate in terms of studio space.
Yes, I'm fortunate to have it, and I'm fortunate where it is. But I did have a space at 1+2 Studios, and I also had I had the dungeon, no windows, no anything, but I got kind of the space I needed. So I've always been a hogger of space, so to speak. My favourite day is actually Friday. Probably has something to do with art, but I was born on a Friday, so I'm Friday's child. And Friday is the beginning of the weekend, and it's the day I would take off and I would go to the galleries. So it's the day, it's kind of, if I've worked all week in the studio, it's the day that I can go and party a bit. And I need that for my practice. So Friday I would go to the studio, afternoon I go to the gallery. And I go for a wander around to look at what it is that I want to look at. So Friday is probably my best. The rest of the weekends, every weekend I'm in the studio. So I'm in my studio 7 days a week, basically.
I can attest to that. Most of the time when we actually in the studio.
Yeah.
You've got beautiful dogs. And if you're in your studio a lot, you're obviously also, Luke works at the National Art School just up the road. So it's a kind of a divvy up of time between National Art School and your studio space.
Yeah, it is. So my answer is sort of similar to Lisa's, but perhaps a little bit different. So as Lisa was saying, I mean, we, as artists, we're normally sort of bouncing between sort of multiple sort of roles. I've been lucky enough not to have a non-art role since second year uni, I think. So I've sort of bounced between studio and gallery work, teaching, all sorts of stuff. I quite like sharing my sort of professional lives as a teacher and as a studio artist kind of in the same mix because, you know, I've just been working with a few people here and the energy that I get from working with students sort of feeds my studio practice and vice versa. You know, if I'm not at the studio enough, I feel like a bit of a phony, a bit of an imposter when I'm teaching. But, you know, I really get a lot of energy from that interaction with students. So Tuesdays for me are a good one. I spend sort of the morning through until about 2 o'clock in the studio, and then I run a program for teenagers up at the National Arts School. Tuesdays are this kind of lovely hybrid of all the things I really value. Yeah, so I'm working on some sculptures, which... Typical me, I don't really know what I'm doing. I'm just pretending that it'll be okay and I'll somehow be able to sort of work it out. I mean, a lot of what I do comes from a kind of confidence I have with my drawing practice, and that's sort of flowed into the paintings that I make and yeah, the sort of wood-carved sculptures that I've been doing. But there's a kind of... Yeah, there's something slightly sort of reckless about the idea of jumping into a medium that I've never been trained to be able to do. But the day sort of starts with, I mean, the sculpture is really nice because you can sort of, like, you can just sort of pick it up as you go. You know, there's unlike, you know, a day of painting where you're setting out a palette and sort of, you know, perhaps prepping surfaces ready for sort of following days. There's a whole lot of stuff to do with sort of pack up and clean up of the materials you're using. The sculpture is really nice because I've just got this big old sort of bench in my studio there. It's covered in chisels and sort of sawdust at the moment. And yeah, I'm working on a series of little wood carvings that are sort of almost like sort of Japanese Netscape scale, like they're tiny little sort of handheld things. I got it into my head that I was going to hand carve a little ruffled collar for a skull that's about the size of a golf ball. So yeah, we'll see how that goes. Let me combine a couple of those thoughts. In terms of the large sort of wall drawings that some of you have seen me make around the place, they're sort of an opportunity, like in terms of that inspiration that you get from sharing your work with other people. They started partly because I'd started teaching. And so I was really interested in that sort of interface between my studio practice and my teaching practice. And so those kind of performative kind of works where I'm drawing on walls live in front of people, you know, they started there, but by way of inspiration, they're a really direct way of sharing what you do with your audience. And so I've sort of gotten to know this sort of overarching project I've been dealing with for the last, let's say, sort of 10 years, around the yellow socks gang, around the idea of sort of masking and loss and sincerity and silliness and all those things I sort of build into kind of the way I describe that work through that interaction with audiences. You know, and it's a really lovely thing because obviously as artists, you know, we 7 days a week in the studio, right? But it's quite a solitary sort of experience. You're sort of there just sort of, you know, grinding away kind of, you know, often maybe in shared spaces, but generally with a kind of privacy sort of, when it comes to studio and practice. And so somehow kind of opening that out and sort of putting that really directly in front of audiences, sometimes students, sometimes just general public audiences, is a great way of just getting to know how the work reads, how the work operates when it's kind of out of your space and suddenly sort of in the world. The permanence, impermanence thing is really interesting. Like really early on, I was one of those people that was determined not to put any pressure on my studio practice to make money. So I always wanted to sort of teach and work in galleries and do other things kind of in the arts industry that allowed me to draw on a wall and then wash it off 2 weeks later and sort of move on. But sort of increasingly, you know, I've been supported, you know, for the last, what are we talking, like?
It must be 8 years. I've also created one of the most remarkable wall drawings I've seen for a client of ours in Brisbane.
A tiny bit longer than that. I think I was there for 9 days. It was 6.5 metres long by about not quite 3 metres. My hands were bleeding by the third day. Yeah, it was brutal. Just really quickly, I gave a talk on Tuesday at National Arts School as part of our winter school, just sort of reflecting on 20 years worth of making those wall drawings. And I did a rough calculation. I think I've spent, it was close to 900 hours drawing on walls, making works that sort of no longer exist in the world. It was kind of wild to sort of stock take that. It was like hundreds of metres worth of sort of gallery wall. And I think it was like what did I say? It was 867 or 897 hours worth of just kind of making, sometimes live, sometimes not, but yeah, all for works that are entirely ephemeral. Badly for the first 15 years. Yeah, because I started that when I was a student. I had no idea what I was doing, and you know, like an old Nokia flip phone with 1.1 megapixels, and yeah, just some pretty sort of grainy sort of photos there. I've had I've gotten a little bit better with that stuff sort of since.
We might pass on to Ria now. And talking about studio practice, but I think as we are surrounded now by these beautiful oil paintings you have here, these actually came about, I'll let Ria talk in detail, but from a fantastic residency that Ria attended in France. So I think it's interesting, both for fellow artists in the audience and collectors, to know the importance of residencies for artists and how it really helps them grow their careers, meet with new collectors and artists while they're there, but just give a whole new dimension to your work.
Okay. I just wanted to say, I was thinking about something this morning while I was getting ready. I remembered a work that I made when I was very young. And it was made out of bits of leather and beads. And it was when I was a kid, I must have been about 16. It was a huge mural of like a tapestry thing of African women dancing. I was born in Zimbabwe and grew up in Zimbabwe. And I remember I was thinking, oh yeah, I destroyed that. I destroyed a lot of work. But it's gone, and all those hours, and it's just, but it's actually a good thing. Do you want me to speak about the residency first, or what was the two other questions? What were you answering?
We were talking about Tuesdays, Fridays.
Yeah.
Yeah, but how's your day start?
How did my day start? I have a very specific routine. So I like to go in the morning. I open up my studio. I let it get air. I walk out. I go grab a coffee. I come back and I read for 45 minutes. And I read every day. And I'll either be reading art history, art theory, philosophy, or something. But I kind of need to bring my head down. And so I'll read and I'll write. I always have in my studio 2 or 3 diaries on the go. And I'll then put on music, and then I'll begin work on whatever it is that I'm working. At the moment, I'm just at the beginning of 2 sets of work. One is for a residency that I'll be doing in September at Bandanon. And that was a very specific project that I wanted to do, very large-scale works on paper, fairly experimental. And then the other is I have a commission, which I've now got underway. But when I'm doing a commission, I normally paint 4 or 5 paintings in one hit. I learned very early on in my practice, I think the first show I had out of art school was a sellout, and a gentleman came and he was very upset that he couldn't buy paintings. So he asked me to do one, so I did one, and then it was a very good learning curve, and I did the painting and he hated it. Because what I realized is that the thing that he wanted was gone, and he couldn't get that thing, even though the painting I made was basically this, very similar. So now when I do a commission, I probably do 4 or 5 in the set. And then the collector, this particular collector has a couple of my other works. They can come into the studio, they can then engage with the works, and they can choose the one that they really like. And then everybody's happy. I'm happy, they're happy, it's all good. So I've actually got 2 things on the go in my studio, the works on paper and the commission set of work. And I think whatever I do after that will go
and
to...
you'll be working to Sydney Contemporary.
Well, that will go to Sydney Contemporary. And so in terms of materials, just briefly, the commission is based on a work or a body of work I made 25 years ago, and they're wax paintings. So I'm kind of going back to working with that material. And wax, I've used wax a lot in my lifetime because I grew up making batiks, a lot of materials. I started more in a kind of textile way with art, painting, but also making textiles. And I grew up making batiks. So wax is kind of part of my language. It's not a new thing to me. I just haven't worked in it for a while. And the works on paper, I've always worked on paper. I think it's essential. So this body of work, just briefly, residencies. I don't really apply for a lot. I'm very selective when I either apply for residency or I'm going to put work in for competition. I do a lot of research, and I make sure that when I apply for something, whether or not I'm going to get it, I am very clear about what it is I'm going for. So for me, understanding what I'm going to do there, why I'm going to do it, is supremely important. And I don't know, maybe I've been lucky, but everything that I've gone for in terms of residencies I've normally got. And I think part of the reason is, like the next one that I would like to go for, I know that in France, the National Library of France has a very big collection of old Armenian books, gospel books, etc. And I want to go and look at their archives, but I've already done that research, so I know exactly, and when I do those proposals, I'm very detailed in exactly what I'm targeting. So this particular residency, I chose to go there because I wanted to be with another group of artists. So for me, it's very important when I go on a residency not to be alone. I'm really going because most of the time when I'm in my practice, I'm on my own, and I wanted that connection with other artists. It's extremely important for me to kind of have that connection. This particular residency, they have artists from across the range. So there are professors who are in literature, there were composers, there were filmmakers, there were people who were doing documentary, and the interesting thing about this particular residency is that not everybody is coming from academic scholarship. So some people were self-taught. There were a couple of filmmakers that I met that were from Hollywood. They were basically learned on the job. So there were runners in films, and it's those kind of people that I'm really interested in meeting. I need that, and so that's why I chose to go there. This work is a little bit different to what I normally do, partly because I actually got sick. I got COVID while I was in residency, and I was isolated, and I woke up every morning at about 4 a.m. and I started photographing the environment while I was there. And I made what I set out to do for that residency, which was some works on paper and some other experimental things that the residency kept for their collection. But when I came back, I was still kind of not that well, and I couldn't use a very fine paintbrush, so I started to paint these. I needed to kind of do something else to get better. So that's.
For those of you that don't know, some of Ria's other works are hanging in the corridors here. So she normally works with acrylic, and these works are specifically with oil.
Yeah. I mean, just on the material, and I guess like Luke, if you've been making art since you were a child, which I assume most artists, I had very good kind of schooling when I was young. In South Africa, when you wanted to go to art school, you had to do 3 years of technical college. So you cannot go to university and study art there unless you've done this 3 or 4 year course in which the first 3 years you are not allowed to use color, for example. I mean, so it's basically based on the French school of teaching. So when I was younger, all I ever did was paint in oil, and then when I came to Australia, I switched. That's another story. Please continue.
Over to you, Lisa.
So I'm a bit, I'm sort of going to tie you two together through me. So I've got a few jobs as well. So I teach at Mass, I work in the gallery, I've got a beautiful collaboration with a colleague, I have my own practice. So I've always, again, managed to not put the pressure on my art practice to make money, but I've always worked within the arts. Like I feel like I've been, I started sort of my gallery career at the Barbican when I was there sort of in school. So I've always had a work practice within the arts. And I've always been studio based. That's kind of like my main my main practice. And in my and I've always really been a sculptor. That's not a painter. I'm very clearly not a painter. I don't like using colour. I absolutely sort of go near it. What was that? And it's like, I think we're going to Luke about like your sort of, because you are a lot of time in the studio on your own, and you're a lot of time in your own head in a way. And I think for most artists, it's like when we make or create, we're actually, that's how we process being in the world. Like that's definitely how I understand where I sit within or what's going on in the world. So it's not very sort of like a didactic process where it's like this is such an obvious thing. But my work definitely helps me understand just being. I think that, and I think a lot of us that when we get into these kind of more later years, you'll find that people who have, or artists that have just, like I've never done anything else other than made art. Like I've dug holes in the ground to get the clay out when I was little. Like it was something that I didn't really need to be taught in a way. And I think it's like we do now because we can't not, and we won't not stop. We won't stop. Like I look at my two beautiful friends there, and we will not stop in a way making art. And I think that's what's really interesting about artists is that it's a passion that really you can't put your finger on. Like it's just something that you do. And so when I go into the studio, it is that, and I think as you sort of like it's a sort of, it's not a treat because we've earned it to be there, but it's such an enriching experience. Even if the work's not going right, you're still having those kind of moments of euphoria in a way. Like I think when you make something that you feel really good about, it's such a buzz. It's like you're on drugs in a way, you know. And because I'm a sort of a walker, and a lot of my work is very much about like understanding place. I do that through walking, but it's like when I leave the studio and you've had a good day, you've got a little skip in your step. It's just ridiculous, but it can literally give you that kind of, and that's what I think that you're perhaps like. You keep looking for more of that kind of, that kind of, it's very adrenaline. And I've got a collaboration with Julia there. Julia? and that's been a real sort of another part of my practice that it's actually kind of given, you know, like I feel like collaboration, we talk about how like isolated it is when you work in the studio. But having a collaboration with someone, not only are we able to, like you can kind of feed back and forth on it, but the risks that we can take in a collaboration, you can't really do as easily when you're on your own. Like, and I find that, like some of the things that Julia and I have done have been such a kind of, it's like adrenaline kicks, aren't they, when we go off and do our thing. So I find that to me is what being able to make art gives me. I don't know if that was the question.
No, it's absolutely fine. And I think some of you, I think, have the opportunity to hold Lisa's new porcelain works. So I think the first time I saw your works, Lisa, they were the sculptural works. They were the paper pieces you created. And I think since then you've done a lot of the.
And I don't think that. Like I also think that there is a sort of very sort of thin thread that runs through my work. But generally, I'm curious to what if I do this? What if I do that? What if I find that? How can I do that? How do I make that do this? And so with these little porcelain things, it was a kind of, it was more a curiosity because I've been working on paper and I love that ephemeralness, but then it was like, I kind of like, oh, I've done that. I needed something, I needed another surface. And these are such a sort of treat to work on because, again, I like there's an element of, and Julie and I often talk about the idea of chance, but the word chance is kind of a bit too loose because we're so skilled in what we know, like all artists are skilled in what they know, but the chance is kind of calculated in a way. It's not like real chance. You know, I kind of, even though, you know, I work with a ceramicist that makes the porcelain, I know what it will do, I'll know how it will respond, and you can kind of, you know, like to get that little wound in there, you basically have to work with it so it's airtight, so when you push it, it resists, so you don't get like a hard line on it. So it's chance, but also it's calculated chance. And with these works that I've done, my works, they're these ideas of like that understanding place, and again it's that idea of this is a chance because walking in my practice is quite prominent. That when you're out walking, there, like for me, it's like this, especially coming from London, it was very much a history beneath our feet because we're always walking. There's always something going on under your feet. And these are all, it's that idea of collecting cracks that have occurred in pavement, or because that was that history of that place, like it really was that place. And then I photograph them, and I can't look for them, they have to find me. There's this kind of funny, like, you can't go looking. And then I sort of laser cut them into the wood, but I think more of those as a sculpture object as opposed to a flat thing. Well, no, it's flat, but I think of them as objects. Yeah, I like things that are sort of robust in themselves. And again, it goes back to that kind of understanding where you are place. I like there's this app that you can actually pin where you are, and it will go through the middle of the world and tell you where you are. Generally, but I like that. And they're called portable holes because it's that idea that you can look at something and it can take you somewhere else. You know, like, and I love the fact that on our phones now, that when you take a photograph, you get the coordinates. Okay, so you really, and I don't turn off that tracking thing, like I quite like it, that I can be, that you know where you are and where you've walked. So they're all of places that have meant something to me at that moment.
So you could almost say they're portals.
Well, they could be portals. I like thinking of the time travelers. You know that there was that TV program that was called Time Travelers, and they walked in the tunnel.
Yes.
Time tunnel. Yeah.
Time tunnel. That's what I sort of feel like. Because when you're working with something that's of somewhere else, for that moment, you know, like one of those. And it sounds a bit decadent. When I was in Pompeii, but when I was in Pompeii, you know, it does it for that moment that I'm working. You're there, and you can. It's a weird travel sort of experience that you can have when I'm sort of working like that.
The title of this lecture, I think, was The Value of Art, I think.
Yes.
And you just mentioned the word skills when you were talking, and we've got some academics here, and I'm just wondering, is the value of art based on the fact that you have been trained academically to be an artist, and as someone that
Yes.
has a gallery, does someone that's just untrained and just developed some kind of natural skill, are they put in the same place and value as artists that have spent years training?
I want to answer that question.
I'm going to be
and I'm going to go back to my residency. So I actually have a PhD. I got it, well, I'm going to graduate 2022. It took me a long time to do it because I did it part-time and took some time off. But anyway, and then I went on this residency to France. And there were 20 of us. And as I said, there was a professor of literature. She's written a number of books, African American woman. Amazing. I mean, she would blow your brain away. She was phenomenal. Young woman in her 30s. I mean, I think she published 4 books already. She's at Cambridge or whatever. Anyway, and there was myself. Of course, I've done many years of study. I have a degree in history and politics. I've done many different jobs, so, you know, I come like full baggage in a way. And then there were part of us, or part of the group, who were not schooled. They did not have academic accoutrement. I think I went there, and when I first arrived, I was like, oh my goodness, there's this whole bunch of people, like, you know, wow. And then I kind of thought, just relax. And this is the great thing about doing a residency with other people, is that I learned from them immensely. I think, to some degree, there are artists who, as children, are naturally gifted. That is a given. They have a skill. And I think I'm probably one of those, maybe, you know, one of those. It doesn't mean that there aren't people who can't go and study art and become artists who didn't do anything with art for the first, whatever, amount of time in their life. But for those who are not schooled, they can still, you can still get an education because you still read, you still, if you're interested in the arts, you will get an informal education and you can still become educated. The issue of attaching value, I actually think that's a very Australian thing. And going away on that residency was a very important and wonderful lesson for me, because you do not have to have an education to be a great artist, so long as you educate yourself in whichever way it is that you get that education. And some people are really gifted as children and they continue with it, some people don't. But it depends what the education side of things gives you. Well, for myself anyway, is that if you manage to get in, I mean, for me to go to university was a big deal, partly because I was really dyslexic, and partly because I had no money, and partly because when I first came to Australia, I had really zero money. I had $200 in my pocket and nothing. So going to get that education for me was a privilege. And once I was there, I mined it. I took everything that I could possibly learn from it. I really sort of had a schooling in South Africa about art, and then everything that I learned from that, I just put in a box and I put underground, and I began to relearn again. So, I mean, it's not a question of education really to the attachment of value. It's a kind of constant learning as an artist.
Because in my gallery role, I see a lot of people coming through who haven't been trained as, you know, they've come to it later in life for whatever reason. And I think it's not necessarily, it's more about how you think. You know, if you're curious and you unpack your thoughts and you're unpacking and you're curious and you're unpacking, you know, I've seen some beautiful work made by people who have done tapestries, and then they've come to it through that way. So I think going to art school can offer, like when you're young, it can actually open doors to, like just open other doors in a way. But to be an artist, it's more about how you think, how you, and that's that thing about you can't not. We can all teach people, you know, like all these steps. You know, we can teach them to draw. I can teach them to weld. You know, I can teach all these things, but I don't think you can teach curiosity.
I mean, it takes, we were talking about this yesterday. I've seen many people who are very skilled, so they probably are more skilled than me at drawing, for example. I'm not saying that I can't draw, but, you know, and then they don't push that, they don't drive that, there's no drive. Then I've seen other people who have had little skill, but the need to make outweighs everything else, and then they drive and then they make a career. Yeah. So it's really, I mean, I think about this question a lot, because while I don't teach, I do mentor quite a few artists, and it's a kind of set of things that kind of comes together. And one of the things that being an artist has taught me is timing. Timing is absolutely essential in this game. Not all of us are fortunate to land up I think I was kind of a fortunate person in one way for the arts. I was so severely dyslexic that I couldn't read until I was 14. But I had this very strong thing about colour, and my parents tell me that I used to scream for pencils, and I used to draw everywhere. And so obviously my brain is kind of wired up differently, that it has this need for colour and it has a need to make a mark. But I couldn't read. So everyone is, given a set of different circumstances. But in that, my family, personally, they loved art. I lived with art. They were all collectors. They talked about art. I went everywhere with them. They always took me to museums and galleries, and for me that was lucky. My mother could paint. I'm surrounded by that milieu, so it doesn't. Yeah, yes.
Yes, well, I was actually going to say that kind of brings us what we were going to talk about as well. I think in terms of saying the value of art, if we're looking at someone's collection, I don't think that a good collection necessarily needs to have all of the works that you would expect to find in a museum. A good collection can be a really wide grouping of things within your home that even don't necessarily relate directly to art. I mean, Luke and I were talking about collecting the other day, and you've got that fantastic bookcase that you had specifically commissioned, which I think is a really interesting part of the commission. I'll let you talk a little bit about that in a second, but I think any great collection that any of us should strive to have should have things that truly mean something to us. Of course, it's amazing to have beautiful museum pieces in there, but you should surround yourself with works of art that really talk to you. When you look at them, you should feel an emotion. It might be an emotion that makes you feel uncomfortable, but it's changing something in you and making you think. And I think anything that makes you think, that makes you question the world, like you were saying, anything that keeps you curious and open about how the world works is an amazing piece to have in your collection. I know I have some beautiful artworks in my collection, but I also have some quite quirky things, which I consider part of my collection, although they wouldn't necessarily have a huge value. Michelle and I were recently in Mexico, and we picked up some funny little, what they would almost be trinkets, but they're now part of my collection, and I feel that they're really valuable. To someone else, they might not mean anything, because they have a very personal meaning to me from travelling and from the art that we saw at that time. And I think any collection has those things. And as you were saying, you're all born artists. You were never going to be anything else. That's what you were born to be. And I think we are all born to be collectors, but it's a choice along our journey whether or not we delve into that and start collecting. People might collect stamps, or there's many different things. Rita's, your mother, your father.
My mother was a philatelist, so she was a stamp dealer, and I grew up with people collecting coins, stamps, and but just on the collecting thing, I think it's curious because I've always collected. The first things I collected were rubbers, and I think I had 3,000 of them. I collected pencils, and I collected paper, and I've got a shell collection. They're all in boxes.
I think that's called a hoarder.
No. And I used to take them all out, and I used to arrange them. But the thing that I found, knowing a lot of collectors too, and other artists who collect, is that partly you're also a kind of curator. You're a curator of your aesthetic. You're a curator of, this is horrible to say. I grew up with everybody curating stuff. They had stuff and they collected stuff. The other thing I used to collect, and we've all collected in the family, are African sculptures that you could buy at the side of the road, soapstone carvings, beautiful things. These beautiful artists that you will never know in a lifetime, and the value of those are just, for me, really precious. But we, buy them, and then I'd take them home, and then I'd arrange them with the basket weaving and the painting at the back. And so I've learned that a lot of collectors, and the value is that you yourselves are curators in a way. You're curating the thing, that vision that you have in your head, which is, as an artist, a very interesting thing when I meet collectors.
I saw a very interesting documentary about American collectors.
Yes.
And the fact is, very rich people are now getting financial advice to buy art.
Yes.
And they're buying very good, expensive pieces. They're taking them out of the jurisdiction of galleries and museums because they can spend a lot more money. And they're putting them on private display. So they're actually taking them out of the world, and in terms of being able to appreciate and see stuff. I think that's a really interesting sort of modern development of collecting art.
It's a kind of sort of, I just think about that idea of, there's these secure containers at airports. This idea, and this is this interesting thing about a product, like what Luke has been talking about, this idea of a product and how that's monetarized. Like as artists, I always feel like, generally artists are as poor as church mice. Like they've got no money, and yet when you go to an art fair and you've got this swirling around of this kind of money in a way that's quite alien to a lot of artists.
Well, this documentary actually had the artists. There were some auctions, and the artist was saying, "I sold you that painting, the 350,000. Now you're getting $4 million."
Yeah, they tried to
And I didn't get any of that money.
They tried to bring in that on a resale, that there was was it 10% or something, of if it went to auction or stuff like that. But it is a funny idea of money and art in a way.
I mean, to some degree, the question that you're asking is an interesting one, but it's not a new one. So, in the older days, the church had the money, and they commissioned artists to make work. An artist wasn't someone who went to the studio and banged away and made something and hoped someone could sell it. Basically, it was a contract. They came to us and said, "Here's what I want, blah, 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 you go and do it." And the only reason we have that artwork was because churches are still standing. The other group of people who bought art were the very wealthy, normally kings, queens, landed gentry, and most of them still have huge collections, and we will never see them. The idea of what money is, the modern world of buying and collecting, really it's from about 1850s onwards. It's really contemporary. It's very new, and the relationship between collectors, collecting, and money can be kind of separated out. Lots of people collect. There are lots of collectors. There was a very famous couple in New York. I think they lived in a tenement house and they bought lots of little artworks. I mean, they had a massive collection when they donated it to the Met.
Yes.
Yeah, it was worth gazillions, millions.
He was a policeman, wasn't he?
Yeah, and so they didn't have a lot of
Very
money.
isolated.
So the need to collect is one thing. Speculation is slightly different. So when the two of those things come together, you have another kind of creature. Us, we make, but if we have to think about speculation, it will destroy the practice. And that is something that I'm very strict, and Lisa is too. When I go to my studio, I really have a set of words in my head and I push all of that. That's not why I'm making. We cannot control the market. The market is controlled by something else. Currently the market is, the world is in such a mess that blah, blah, blah. It will impact the market. But collectors, genuine collectors, mostly have a really good eye. They kind of understand their process of collecting, and their relationship to me, the artist, is something that mostly you grow together with. When I meet a collector, and people who've collected my work particularly, they normally buy more than one piece, right? And they come to your studio, and what's beautiful about that relationship is that suddenly you meet someone who's equally as quirky as you. They don't paint, but they collect. And they're interested in a set of ideas, and bingo, you've got Jack. Now they are not, but, all those collectors that made a lot of money, particularly in the USA, when they bought, they weren't necessarily thinking like, for example, Rothko is going to be selling in 20 years' time at X billion. We do that now because we've got history, we can look back, and you're making a judgment call, and that's the market.
But I think artists, when we all collect, because
Yeah, I collect.
Look, you've got a house full of artworks.
Yeah, I mean, sort of my take on some of this is, does anyone know that Michael Landy project breakdown? I always use it when I'm talking about my own sort of studio practice. He's a British artist. When he was about 33, he did a project where he systematically catalogued and destroyed every single personal possession that he had.
Oh
Mm.
Yeah. So it was sort of performed in this sort of mock factory space, just near the National Gallery in sort of quite sort of luxury looking sort of shop front. And quite literally, that's right. Exactly, yeah. There's the Art Angel, they were the organisation, they're a bit like sort of cowboy projects, and they sort of put up the money for it, and there's a fantastic website that has sort of all sorts of documentation.
Who were the ones that burned the
KLF.
money?
KLF.
They burned
$1
the
billion.
and that was art ritual. I think.
Right, oh, interesting. Yeah. So, I mean, that work is a really interesting provocation, I think, to sort of think about all sorts of different things. I love talking about that one with students because it can hurt their brains a little bit. It's an interesting one in the way it's sort of aged. I think we have a different take on that work, sort of, 20 odd years later from when it was performed. There's a kind of pre and post social media version of that, because when Michael Landy performed that work, he didn't have a social media footprint, none of that sort of existed. So that work these days would look very different to the way it sort of looked back then. But just for me personally, like I remember when I sort of came across that work, and the context was the idea of ephemerality and these wall drawings and the idea of erasure and these things I've been sort of thinking about conceptually. And it just got me thinking like stock taking how many things that I had surrounded myself with that I had some actual personal connection to. And it was a slightly frightening thought. Like, I had no idea who made this jumper. Who the hell made my shoes? There's so many things in my life that I just had no direct connection to. But the sort of glass half full version of that was I started sort of thinking, well, yeah, that beautiful bookshelf that a furniture maker friend of mine sort of made for me, that I got him to design, so it sort of fit this little couch I had, and it's custom made, so the biggest of my art books, which is a sort of, I think that Tash and Caravaggio sort of monograph, which is a sort of pretty handsome scale, that was the exact height, allowing for, maybe sort of 15 mil gap of the bottom shelf. I love the idea of the direct connection I have with some of the things that are in my house. And as Lisa was saying, we tend to live relatively modestly as
But
Oh,
I
artists.
think we do a lot of swaps.
A lot of swaps, yeah.
A lot of swaps.
Yeah, I mean, beside that bookshelf, one of my favourite things I've got in my collection, an artist friend of mine, Julia Robinson, who some of you will know her work perhaps without knowing her name. She's got works in the MCA collection. She was in the Adelaide Biennial, the National, but she was archaeologist of South Australia for an exhibition based around Rodin sculptures. And so she was commissioned to make a new piece for that. I was sharing studio space with her at the time. She cast my legs for the sculpture. And so it's a bit hard to explain, but actually, Rhea, if you stood up. Sorry, bit of yeah. The sculpture is basically, if you imagine, just lean towards me. Yeah, it's that, but from there up, it's basically piping that she's covered in a sort of canvas. So it's this set of legs wearing gold pantaloons and grey stockings, and then it sort of is like this weird conjoined sort of twin thing. I'm cast with my legs. I've got a tiny little apartment and just this huge double version of myself sort of sitting beside this bookshelf. It's like, I really value that sort of stuff.
I think it's really curious when you, people will go around people's houses and make decisions, they look at your book collection,
Yes.
they look at your
photos.
or if you look at your record collection, or, there's all these kind of ways of people looking. But I did go around to some artists' friends' houses, and I went into their bedroom, and they had these two enormous drawings of themselves in there. And I thought that was so quirky. It was so quirky that that's what they had in their bedrooms.
Can I just ask one question about, there is the monetary value of art, but when you're doing art, are there any pieces where you've got an emotional value to it, or an emotional connection that you find very hard to give up, or you want to keep?
Oh yeah. I can say yes for all of them. It's very harsh trying to pry anything off anyone.
Right, yeah. Well, I can imagine Luke, given the fact he's quite happy to wash it off the walls, that he's getting more out of it than actually.
Sorry, are you talking about works that we make or works that we've collected?
Works that you make. Obviously, if you've grabbed something, there is a connection, and you want that to keep. But no, I'm just talking about the art that you make.
But when you do your wall drawings, is there like, because sometimes, I mean, everybody because like a lot of people, we work, like I'll do one of those, and I go, oh, I can do another one, do a bit like this. And then I'll do it, and it kind of keeps you, it's that curiosity that keeps what keeps going on. But like, suppose you look at it and go, those hands are a bit shit. Yeah, so it's like, but that is a drive that goes, oh, I could, like keeps the fire in a way that thinks, yeah, I want to do another one.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it is not pivot back to, when the hands are a bit shit in the work that is in the frame. That's a whole different, yeah.
But we'll look then.
And is that when you start thinking about the guy who struggled with work?
Well, yeah, maybe. Yeah, we should do breakdown too.
But there is something quite, there's a great, isn't it, Louise video where she's like literally pushing stuff off the shelf. There's something sometimes quite satisfying. It's like sometimes I can work over and over and over and over and over on a drawing, and you've pushed it until almost there's no drawing left, and you go, nah, you're done. Yeah, in the bin. And it's quite like, yeah.
Well, I know ceramics, they say there's often mistakes. Can be good or bad, because you lose, once it's in the kiln, sometimes you lose control over what's going to come out again.
Well, you do, and I think that's it. But that's that thing. It's like, how do you know when you could ask any artist, how do you know when a work's finished?
It's finished, yeah.
It's their questions that's perhaps another reason why people keep doing it, is because how do you know when something's finished? Like, why do I think that's okay, but that's not okay? And that goes back to that thinking as an artist, that curiosity. It's like, what is that thing that, like, why did Luke keep going, And it is that thing of like, when is something finished? It's a really interesting, I always think of art is actually, we're problem solvers. Like, we often give ourselves a problem, in a sense, even though it's like might be, I'll paint this or that. But it's generally your problem solving.
Does that change though depending on the style? Because Luke's doing what I call kind of OnlyFans Renaissance kind of art.
I love that. I'm officially stealing that. My next article. It used to be Monsters and Dick but now it's OnlyFans Renaissance.
But, you've got figures, so you know kind of when you're finished because the figure's completed. Abstract art must be a little bit more difficult. Like, when do you know?
It talks to you, and I think that goes across the board.
Does it?
Can I ask a question, Luke?
Yeah.
Because I have driven on drawer on the wall, not representation, the other drawing, did a whole installation, and then it was washed. But I went through in my own studio before I did the installation in the gallery. And what was more interesting to me was when I washed it and didn't remove it all, the trace that was left had something else to say. And I'm just wondering if you get that when you start to wash back.
I'm sorry, I was going to say, I really liked those works of yours. When I first met you, you'd drawn in two different materials.
Yes.
So that idea of that erasure left that brought that other work to light. Like, that was something that was my first kind of introduction to your work.
And those are the first ones that Michelle and I saw in your studio.
Yeah.
I enjoyed the materiality of it as the way that fought with each other.
So for context, for anyone who hasn't seen those, I was doing works with sort of acrylic paintings or ink paintings underneath charcoal or sort of pastel drawings. And so you could erase the top layer of the drawing, but without knowing that there was something underneath, you know, that ink layer or that acrylic layer would start to sort of emerge. But Linus, it's kind of interesting, like at what point is the potential for the loss more poetic than
I don't think that even matters, because there's different points that give you something different at each stage.
Yeah.
But to me, that leaving of trace. I mean, when we all use materials and we're aware of the surface that we're working on, most of when you're painting, the surface is sealed, and then you work on top of that. I don't seal it. My paint goes into the canvas. You know, and all those things of how it sits with the material, how a mark, you know, reflects a piece of paper. I mean, I'm thinking of the thing that came to mind immediately was the race to Kooning drawing. And
So
the texture behind
Rauschenberg.
that, it's left with that at the end of it. But there are other examples of what's the English drawer? I can't remember his name. That worked on his drawings so much that, you know, got holes in the paper. I mean, all of that. We talked about wounding.
Yeah.
You know, every surface we deal with in the world at some point is wounded. Either we destroy it, it's obviously wounded, and there are other things that just get touched. You can see it in nature, you know, the way insects will eat a leaf or do something to a tree, the way weather affects things, the way fire affects things. You know, that trace is a very, it's a way of thinking about the integration of everything we do in the world. I sometimes think as artists, you know, we think it's something special, but it's not. We're just giving voice in a way that we can as artists, a visual voice, to how we move through the world and then what we leave for others to see. And then it's up to them to see that, you know, what did they take from that? How do they relate? How do they connect to other things? I think the question is much more holistic when we think of the world, or just life in general. I mean, it's bigger than just this world. But I think we forget that we're part of all of that as artists. We show people. Sometimes we can slow people down long enough to start to notice figures that walk by them, or, you know, figures on the stage, or the shadow of figures walking down the street. You know, they all have it. I was just looking at an image of this the American photographer, a woman that was never discovered. What's the name?
Vivian.
No, exactly. Vivian.
Like, we've always have those conversations. It's like, all you're doing is, as an artist, and I think you want to put it like as a little a, all you're doing is just trying to understand what's going on, and that's just our way of doing it. And we had an opening the other night at the gallery where I work, and the speaker got up and he just said we should actually spend more time like looking at how artists look at the world, because we're so busy looking at, you know, this, you know, like this very sort of black and white in a way. And I think a lot of artists, we see the world as grey. It's like it's all, we can see like every you can see, it depends on obviously what kind of how you look, but it's like now my new word is 3D thinking. But it's not 3D thinking as in like 3D thinking. It's actually being able to hold conflicting ideas in your head at once. I mean, and actually having those pull and push and pull and push. And I think that again then goes back to that, can we teach curiosity? Because what you just said is exactly how artists think and look. And you did that so articulate, and it is, it's like, we just look and think slightly, a little bit.
I mean, but the question earlier on about going to get an education in the arts, whichever way you do it, through a TAFE or university, whatever, is that, I mean, that thing is that you have that, and sometimes doing formal study allows you to articulate the things that you've been doing forever. It allows you to understand. And in terms of the collector on the other side, the buyer, it then allows allows you to communicate what you're doing. And that process might seem really, really simple, but it's actually really complicated in a way. You've got to understand what you've been doing forever. The formal education gives you a way, if you're sensitive enough, to go, this is the language I need to use in order to talk to a wider audience. You know, that's like developing a muscle. Correct. Because when you go to university or you go to study, I mean, if I look back on my practice, all of us, we've kind of been doing what we've been doing from day dot. It's not like, you know, to some degree, sometimes when I step out of my little line that I've been doing work for the last 10, 15 years, or when I do something like this, for the people who don't know me, this is an oddity, but for the people who know me, they know my practice, they're like, oh yeah, you've come back, you did it. But going to university and the value, you know, that's the value, and then the value to the person who's going to buy your work is that they find confidence in that. You know, it's for the person who's going to spend money on your paintings. I mean, when I'm mentoring someone, I always say, it's a privilege when someone buys my work. No one needs to buy it. Someone is going to give good money to buy my work and put it in their house. I mean, if you really think about it, it's kind of mind-blowing. It's like, oh my God, you know, wow, it's super special. But I have to be able to communicate with that person. I know lots of artists who are not that good at it. And it's sad because their skill set is really great, but they don't come. So that's part of the university thing, and that's the value. And then I guess the emotional value to work. There's work in my studio that I've had
A long time.
a long time. I kind of curate my studio. I have things that I've bought that I love that have traveled many countries with me. I have work. I have a single print of something that I know people come in and they love it. Someone else came in the other day, were like, oh, can I have it? I'm like, no, it's not for sale.
I'm a great binner.
I'm also a great binner, and I've just destroyed a whole bunch of work. But there is a process of selection, and certain things do live with you. They travel with you, and they speak to you, and it's very important, right? I think...
I'm a bit like, if you've got a t-shirt in the drawer and you haven't worn it for a year, it's in the bin. And it can be a little bit like that with my work.
But I think maybe at this point, just as a kind of a wrap up, I think my words to all of you is that as collectors, you are absolutely vital in the role in any artist's life. You may not think that you're having a huge effect on them, but you are. Even that one work that you bring into your collection, you are bringing that artist's work into your home. Now, I know some of you here have amazing collections. I've been lucky enough to have been to some of your homes and seen them. And I honestly think opening up your homes and sharing what you have in your home with other people is so important, because they get to see what you have in your collection. They get to see why you've put those works together and why you've chosen specific works. To go back to you saying about the Americans buying a lot of works, I think we have to be hopeful that in Australia we will reach the point one day that they may be already reached in countries like Japan. There are some amazing private collections in Japan that are open to the public, that you can go and see these fantastic master artworks that individuals have chosen not to keep for themselves and to keep hidden away, but they've chosen to create museums to share those works with the world.
The Judith Nelsons of the world.
Yes, exactly. And I think the more and more people like that we can create within this world, the better place it will be for everyone who loves and appreciates art. But it all starts with all of you. Even just buying works for me in your home, inviting your friends around, that's a path that, we might not all have millions of dollars to be able to create those wonderful collections. But I think everyone can start by sharing their works and inviting people in. You all have beautiful works by artists that you swap with and you work with, and that creates an amazing collection that all of you have. And I think everyone here is able to do that in some way or other.
One of the nicest stories I heard was doing a tour with the Art Gallery New South Wales. We went to Newcastle. There was an exhibition on there, but we went to James Drinkwater's house, and he and his wife were buying art for the kids, the tiny children, because they said, what's all these toys we're going to throw away,
Yeah.
but we can actually give them the gift of art. I thought that was just wonderful.
Oh, it's fantastic. But I think I'd like to say a huge thank you to our wonderful gallery artists. They're going to hang around for a little while, so if you would like to have some more questions, grab a glass of wine, ply them with questions, and thank you